We are live. Welcome to the Carl Vibe Show. Today I have a very special guest that I've been excited to talk to and finally got to meet in person after a long time coming, and that is Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, a prolific researcher in anthropology and in the specific topic of Bigfoot, where he's drawn a lot of attention, specifically with his research and specialization in anthropology and locomotion, bipedal locomotion of these interesting creatures. So without further ado, I would love to bring Dr. Meldrum in because I'm stumbling over my words already and he's an expert on the topic. And so let's let him go ahead and describe this. Dr. Meldrum, thanks so much for joining me tonight. It's been such an honor to get to meet you at Phenomicon and have you come on the show tonight. So how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to visit with you and get acquainted better.
So, Dr. Meldrum, the topic of Bigfoot isn't the whole story. You got involved in this because of your fascination and research and your education and everything. Maybe give us a little bit of a background to how you kind of got into the field and what has intrigued you with the topic.
Well, sure. Well, I'm by profession an anatomist and anthropologist, physical anthropologist. That is, I teach human gross anatomy in the health professions programs. It's a graduate level full dissection course for graduate OT and PT students, PA students, nursing, radiographic sciences, a lot of the allied health professions. And I do research as a physical anthropologist on the evolutionary history of the human adaptation to walking on two legs, as you described it, bipedalism. So I'm and under that umbrella, my interests have taken me to various analogs of both bipedal and quadrupedal movement in primates in order to understand our own adaptation better. And so, since my youth, when I was first exposed to the concept of Bigfoot, the notion that there could be this unknown or unrecognized bipedal primate out there was always rattling around in the back of my brain. And what a fascinating opportunity for a student of the evolution of human bipedalism to have a living analog for comparison and contrast of our own adaptation. Let alone just the fascination of the topic intrinsically of itself. And so that's, but from a professional standpoint, that's the perspective I approached it with, and that is, the evidence associated with its bipedalism. And part and parcel of my research has obviously been looking at footprints, fossilized footprints as evidence of that evolution of bipedalism in the hominin fossil record, and of course studying modern human footprints as a means of comparison. And so I was in a particular, kind of an exclusive club. There aren't very many members. The interest in this subsequent generations of anthropologists has continued to grow in the field of hominin bipedalism, and so there are more and more people with those same interests and experiences now, and skill sets that far exceed my own in its modern technical technological era. But I was in a position to say something about these footprints that hadn't been said yet or hadn't been considered yet. Dr. Krantz, I must acknowledge, I was standing on Dr. Krantz's shoulders, who likewise was a physical anthropologist with a lot of knowledge of anatomy. And he also likewise focused as a result on the footprint evidence and had done a lot of very good work. There were some things that I think I brought in a fresh perspective and allowed us to sort of extend or expand the horizons of our consideration of the interpretation of those footprints as the fossil or as the footprint record continued to grow. I mean, that's one of the benefits of being able to say, I have over 300 footprint casts, and and dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, more photographs of footprints in the ground or casts that I have not had the opportunity to examine firsthand or to copy. When you have consistency, I mean, across decades, if not centuries, well, not centuries, obviously, but decades of time and geography, even spanning the globe, examples of footprints that are absolutely equivalent from China, associated with the Chinese Yeren. I mean, that really drove a nail in the lid of this subject in my mind. I guess that's the wrong analogy. That alludes to the depth of the idea. It was a bolster, a prop, I guess, another arrow in the quiver, because here were these footprints from China that were just absolutely consistent. I mean, down to showing the mid-tarsal pressure ridge, this critical expression of the model of the Sasquatch foot that I've proposed.
Even consistent with the North American tracks that we've seen and everything. I'm getting a little bit of an echo. Do you happen to have some headphones nearby?
You know, I
maybe turn the volume down on your computer just a little bit.
Yes, let me do that.
No problem. But yeah, I find that fascinating while you're working on that that there's not more people interested in specializing in the topic, because you would think that with even in the subject of anthropology, that the bipedalism throughout history and our own human history is such a critical, lack for not pun not intended, a critical step in our human history.
Yeah.
To suddenly go upright. And maybe you can speak to that as to why bipedalism is such a phenomenon and why that is so rare even now to find tracks in the wild that seem to be bipedal, why that is such a big deal.
Well, there's been a lot of discussion and debate about what was the impetus and the sequence of events that led to the evolution of hominin bipedalism. And for the longest time, it has been considered a particular adaptation of the hominin radiation. That was the adaptation that set us apart from those species that gave rise to the living great apes. That position is not as ironclad and unassailable as it was considered in the past, because more and more, first we've blurred, the line was somewhat blurred by the recognition of Ardipithecus, a particular genus, as a hominin ancestor, and attributing it with the habit of bipedalism, when it had a foot that looked like a modern chimpanzee, essentially.
With the one toe
proportions, right, with the divergent big toe.
Okay.
Very thumb-like. I use my hand as an analogy there because of the remarkable thumb-like nature of that divergent, grasping big toe, and other aspects, limb proportions. I mean, you stand up the reconstruction. Ray Matterness is a forensic anthropologist, anthropological artist, that did the National Geographic reconstruction of Ardipithecus, and you put it up on one of my slides. I have it juxtaposed beside an upright standing bonobo or pygmy chimp, and they're virtually indistinguishable. I mean, there's differences in the details of some of the joints and in the cranial anatomy, slight differences, but and so that kind of blurred that boundary. I mean, if we're calling this a hominin, and it clearly is not fully committed to bipedalism. It's at best a facultative biped. That is, it's capable of standing upright and walking, but it doesn't do it all the time. And unlike us, where we find it very difficult to go down on all fours, we're obligate bipeds. It's not. And so if it's a hominin, is bipedalism the litmus test for membership in that group, that clade? Now there have been other discoveries of other Miocene apes, like Danuvius was one that was recently described, which its pelvis and limbs suggested a very upright posture, but all the arboreal, long curved digits, divergent big toe, and a grasping foot, all adaptations for climbing in trees. And yet it had these morphologies that were seemed to be anticipating, if not part and parcel with the habit of standing upright. So, was it coming to the ground? Was it just foraging in an upright posture in the trees, or what? And so this has always been a little bit of even when I was a graduate student, one of my professors had advocated early on that our upright posture probably evolved in the trees as opposed to on the ground. Seems counterintuitive, but it's that upright orientation of the trunk in animals that do a lot of vertical climbing or that hang from below the branches, that have lost their tail and have incorporated that musculature into a pelvic diaphragm to help support the abdominal viscera in that upright posture where they're sagging down into the pelvis instead of hanging beneath a suspension bridge like the spine. So anyway, the point simply being, it's a long technical diatribe there, but it just this is why it's such a fascinating topic. There is no clean-cut answer right now, and we keep on discovering new fossils that shed new perspectives, new insights, provide new insights into the way in which bipedalism may have evolved, and perhaps more than once. Perhaps there was just this propensity and it popped up. It may be that Bigfoot doesn't share real recent ancestry with us, but rather it has evolved to walk on two legs in a convergent fashion from a more distantly related ancestor, but one that was equipped with some of the same characteristics and found itself in the same types of environments that our ancestors did. That has yet to be determined. I mean, it kind of, it's interesting and fascinating to talk about the possibilities, to frame those possibilities within the context of what we know and what we suspect. But ultimately, it's going to require examining a specimen to get to the bottom of those questions. So.
Right. It sounds like there's a lot of these transitionary fossil records that are coming forward that seem sort of like a mishmash of in between, almost like, and it's hard to tell then, you're saying, are these hominid creatures, are they coming down from the trees, or is it, I always imagined that it was something to do with leaving the forest line into like grasslands and the need to suddenly see above the tall grass of the plainlands or something like that, forces something that's normally down on all fours to suddenly need to look up around a lot. And then you get this kind of adaptation going on over generations of trying to see above while you're moving. So
there's a whole litany of kind of just so stories, you could almost label them as. That's one of them, seen up over the grass, striking out into the open savanna, perhaps to scavenge carcasses of where all the big games are concentrated out there. That's one. Thermal regulation, when you're out there in the open, not in the shade, the cool shade of the closed canopy of the forest, then and you're very active, then heat dissipation is a real issue. And so one of the thoughts is that the upright posture exposes less surface area to the sun. We've lost this is another possible explanation for losing our covering of thicker hair, is that it provides more surface area for much more numerous sweat glands. We sweat more than any other primate. That watery sweat is responsible for evaporative cooling, especially our head. And, but the top of our head, for the most part, most of us, some of us start to have to cover the bald spot there, but our head remains rather protected. The one horizontal surface that's exposed to the sun to a much greater degree with a covering of thicker hair. So there's a whole whole carrying things is another important element.
Right.
Carrying resources back to a home base or back to a mate, who's stuck at home with the kids, so to speak. So the male goes out foraging and has to bring provisions back. And
so
so
possibly
that's
even the
another.
development of subtle social structures of having to play a role suddenly
Right.
forces a species
Yeah.
to have to stand. It almost speaks the volumes to kind of the anomaly of what it is to be a human and the way that we are, and how fascinating that is, because you compare us to anything else on the planet and we really don't quite fit, do we? It's a little bit strange.
We are a bit, yeah. There's no question that we are another species of primate, but yes, our intelligence, and then of course with that our culture has catapulted us into a whole different set of circumstances, as is evident on the news every night and every morning.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I try to stress to my students that we are biological organisms, and we like to think of ourselves as apart from nature instead of a part of nature.
Yeah.
But yet, our circumstances are quite different. We have that legacy, but then superimposed on that are the veneers of intelligence and culture and so forth. So social behaviors.
That's true. So it makes Bigfoot and the topic of the Sasquatch really fascinating, because where does it fall in that category, in your opinion? Does it fall into the animal kingdom, or does it begin to fall into sort of a hominid or sort of human, sort of
Right.
indigenous species of sorts?
Yeah, and I'm glad you elaborated there with some sort of intermediate alternatives, because so often people take a question like that and it's black or white. It's
Right.
either human or it's ape. They make this contrived dichotomy, and they don't recognize the spectrum, the kind of continuum, differences of degree rather than differences of kind, even as we consider the known great apes and other primates as compared to other mammals. I mean, we are within an order that has a much higher degree of encephalization. I mean, unless you turn to the oceans and look at the cetaceans, and for the longest time, the cetaceans, the porpoises, dolphins, and whales, they were the brains on the block. And up until early Homo, about 2 million years ago, were the first to surpass the cetaceans in encephalization quotient, the relative size of the brain relative to the body mass.
Right.
And so, when I look at Sasquatch, one of the things that strikes me, though, is, well, first, that it is a biological species. I mean, I think it's well adapted. You don't have to appeal to some extraordinary explanation, stepping through an interdimensional portal or time travel or space travel or whatever. I mean, they look as at home in where they're at as the mountain gorillas do on the tops of the Virungas in East Africa. And with that in mind, when you look, there just are none of the trappings of what we associate with humans. Even the most, quote, Stone Age populations that have avoided contact with civilization, our idea of civilization, still they have stuff. They have material culture. They have stone tools. They have clothing. They have adornments. They have structures to live in, to protect them and store things and so forth. And Sasquatch don't. I mean, there's no evidence of that anyway.
Right.
There's no evidence of that, despite claims like glyphs and structures and tree structures and various things like that. I mean, people who, with all due respect, people who say they are forest people in the sense that we are people, as opposed to any other, a generic use of that term to open our arms to all living things. They are not people. They are primates, yes, but they show nothing of what we associate with people.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I've had the luxury, the privilege of spending time up close with non-human primates, with orangs and chimpanzees and spider monkeys, even, and gibbons, and it's an experience. I mean, not to diminish the intelligence and the level of interaction that I have with my own, say, pet dogs. It's a different interaction with a primate. And people who don't appreciate that don't recognize the corollaries between what we see in the anatomy and behaviors of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and other great apes. The person who really was on the cutting edge of this, beat me to the punch, was Dr. John Bindernagel. And his first book, North America's Great Ape, the Sasquatch, the approach he took was he was a professional wildlife biologist, and he navigated, even though primates were not his specialty, he navigated that literature in a very scholarly fashion, very adroit fashion. And so he laid out the parallels there, and example after example of where eyewitnesses had the composure, the presence of mind to take note of details of anatomy and or behavior. He could show, he laid out in the literature descriptions of those anatomies and behaviors in very similar fashion in the living great apes. And it's hard. You just I don't think anyone rationally can dismiss that.
Yeah.
Emotionally, you can grab onto a belief system that or some subjective experience that you interpret in such a way that you think that provides justification for adopting a different point of view.
Right.
But it's that. I mean, it's limited to that. It's limited to an opinion. And that's an opinion is very different than a data-based conclusion.
And there are a lot of opinions that revolve around it, and a lot of conspiracies around this topic too.
Yeah.
One of the ones that ties into what we're just talking about here is this idea that, like, why would the National Park Service or the government keep the secret if they knew? And it goes back to that argument of, like, if these were an indigenous species of some kind, people are afraid that it would carve out their hunting grounds, or somehow that would suddenly shift the designation to the land and the land usage, and suddenly America would be completely redefined to accommodate this new species if it was acknowledged. And so they would rather put it in sort of a blind spot or keep it a secret. What is your thoughts to that?
Well, I think that's a very realistic possibility. I don't know how probable. Again, I can only speculate beyond my own personal experience, and my own experiences have pointed to, or have been at the sort of mid-management level, and at that level, district rangers or supervisors, administrators of parks or of national forest or U.S. Fish and Game district offices and so forth. And we've spent John Maienzinski, a colleague that I've spent a lot of time in the field with, and he and I actually went around through Western Wyoming and visited a whole string of these offices, and had conversations with the personnel, the staff there, and provided information. I gifted copies of my book to their offices, and our field guides, and our some of our papers that have been published. We shared summary maps of the region where incidents had been logged and so forth. But the point being is that there was no evidence of any kind of conspiratorial suppression of information, but rather occasionally there were individual personalities who felt that it was an embarrassment to their reputation, potentially their credibility, or they were very sensitive about the perception, the public perception. Again, it's a question of credibility. The public perception of the use of public funds, and so they put the kibosh on any kind of proactive research for that reason. But no evidence of anything from on high. Here's just one case in point. John was having a conversation. He has done a lot of work in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. He works of late, or had been of late, working with the bighorn sheep in the Wind River Range, but he was involved with one of the extensive grizzly bear studies in the greater Yellowstone, and so interacted with a lot of these wildlife biologists and agency personnel, well known by them and so forth, and so was privy to their reports, their sightings, and he had the opportunity to visit with the director of public relations at Yellowstone National Park on a different topic. But as he always does, very deftly, he can turn the conversation to Sasquatch and get some information, bring it up, and so he did. And the woman said, "Oh, that's fascinating. We don't have any stories like that from the park." And he said, "Oh, as a matter of fact, you do." She said, "Really?" And she says, "Well, why have I never heard of them?" He said, "Because your staff are not comfortable. They don't feel confident to report it up the chain of command for fear of retribution or stigmatizing them." And she said, "Oh, I'll have to look into that." I mean, so she was just absolutely oblivious to the fact that quite a few. Now, there's been a couple of rangers. I can't. His name escapes me now. I knew I wouldn't be able to think of his name, but a very famous ranger from Yellowstone who retired, and he published his memoirs, and in there he actually includes a couple of reports, some that he was directly involved with, and others that came to his attention that had occurred within the park. I've had experiences where there was two retired police officers, and they were detective level officers, crime scene investigation and forensic investigation and so forth. But they had an encounter, a sighting in the western part of Yellowstone, just west of Old Faithful, and they knew about me, so they brought it to my attention. We had the opportunity to go up and sort of examine the scene where they had pulled off in a turnabout, and when they opened the doors to get out to stretch, and he noticed this figure walking. It was walking in the shadow, walking along the tree line in the shadow that the trees were cast, so it was kind of hiding itself. And someone on the other side of the car door who hadn't seen it, or car rather, who hadn't seen it yet, slammed their door shut. And at that point, it stopped dead in its tracks, and just turned and stepped into the trees out of sight. But we sat and recreated it and measured off the distance, and it was about 80 feet was all that when it finally turned. And he was able to see it quite well. And so it happens. I mean, that's the thing. We can sit here and talk about these individual experiences when it's one thing to be an armchair skeptic and just offhandedly dismiss these things. Oh, they just saw a bear. Or it was something else. They imagined something. But when you actually visit firsthand, face to face, and especially when you can have that person at the scene reliving the experience and see their body language, see their reaction, it's not so easy to, these are trained observers. These are objective, critical investigators. And that's the case over and over again when you have, the quality and skill set, the experience, the maturity, of the eyewitness certainly comes into play. Not all sightings are equal.
Right.
But yeah, there are a lot that
and this is the thing that I want people to understand that come across this video or listen to this podcast, is that, like, it's so fascinating to me. You're talking about Yellowstone, and one time years ago I got really curious and I did the math. I looked up the national numbers and I thought I wanted to see exactly how many people in an entire year go and visit national parklands, and go pay for the ticket and go to the national park. So I got that total number. And then I thought, okay, let's say if all of those people over the course of an entire year, if they all went on the same day and they spread out to all the national parks equidistant, so every visitor stood equally separate from each other to spread the nation and try to look for Bigfoot. And still, even if they were able to do that, as hostile as some of those territories would be to even try to do that, each individual person would have to look and cover 3.5 acres of wilderness by themselves to try and find something. And so even if it was that impossible, and so when you mention these armchair skeptics, all anybody has to do is like go up to one of these spots where like a sighting occurred and walk around a little bit. And honestly, like, it really instantly impresses on you, like, okay, 20 feet over there off the trail behind some of those trees, anything that grew up or lived its entire life generationally in this environment where its entire means of survival was to hide and crawl around and be stealthy and avoid detection, like, you would never ever find it. You would never ever see anything like that.
Absolutely. I mean, their appearance is the perfect camouflage, the perfect ghillie suit. I saw there was a TV show. What was it, Jag or something? But they had a scene where the chopper comes down and out jump the two snipers in their ghillie suits. And as they were hunched forward and running, it just struck me, man, that looks like, I can imagine that would be what a Bigfoot would be like. But your point's well taken. If they just stand still, even in plain sight,
or just lay down,
you're actually noticing them. Because our vision is so keyed to motion. Sometimes, we can not see anything at all until it moves. But it's and
when you think about even like a trained sniper or a Navy SEAL or something like that, who's trained, they might have a decade of training, where you're talking about hominid living up in the wild, its entire life, multiple generations, its entire way of eating and living in survival, which is way above even a trained sniper in order to be able to avoid detection. So it blows my mind that people can't even fathom the possibility. And then when you also think of really rationally, or even try to attempt to go fake a realistic track, and how impossible it would be for hoaxers to keep up with the amount of evidence that actually is come across and found every year. It blows my mind that there's people just don't think about it rationally. It's immediately dismissed. So
it's an example of that was some years ago. There was we were invited by it was Richard Greenwell and I were invited by BBC Wildlife to write an article, to submit an article about Bigfoot. And they seemed to be very supportive and everything, but they sat on it and they sat on it and they sat on it. Well, finally, we discovered why. They were waiting for, there was a BBC producer, film producer by the name of Chris Packham, a young upstart producer who, to make a name for himself, he set out to debunk the Patterson-Gimlin film. And so they put his article side by side with ours. It became kind of a, he said, she said. But he made this, I watched an interview with him as well, and he repeated this. But in the article, he says, of course, America is a large and vast country. But he qualifies it, but everyone knows there's not one square inch that hasn't been, these were his words, trammeled by backpackers and hunters and miners and prospectors and loggers. And, I felt like saying to him, never had the opportunity really, but hey, Chris, come on over here. Let me take you out and drop you off somewhere, put a blindfold on you, drop you off somewhere, and we'll just see how fast you're trammeled by all this human traffic you envision out here. You know,
Yeah.
it just emphasized that there are people who haven't a clue. They
Yeah.
have no sense of scale. They have no sense of the remoteness. They have no historical sense of the fact that today, as compared to say just 50 years ago, there are actually fewer people living in the backcountry. They're more in the urbanized settings. Hunters, unless they can get there on an ATV, don't go back off road very far. There are some intrepid ones who do, but it's more and more. I mean, I've talked to someone one day. We bumped into a guy who was a professional outfitter, and what was he doing? He was mending fences, and he said, yeah, I would much rather be out doing what I normally do professionally. He said, but there's no business. No one wants to go back. No one wants to pack back into the wilderness. They all do it from their ATVs. He said, my business has just dried up in the past decade. So he's resorted to mending fences now.
So it's possible that even those deep country locations where these things could live might even be more open to them to move than of late. So that's so fascinating. And I even read a thing that in Yellowstone alone, that just in the last like 2 years, they decided to survey the riverways, and because of drone technology, they were able to fly drones up these rivers that are really difficult to get through. So this claim of like every square inch has been hiked or backpacked is ridiculous, because with just this little survey, they discovered like over 300 waterfalls that had never been mapped before, and these are waterfalls on the rivers. And so and waterfalls aren't going anywhere. It's not like they're moving or migrating or hiding in caves or anything, or nocturnal. So, I mean, maybe Dr. Meldrum, you can talk about that a little bit. What is some of the evidence, like when you first started investigating this stuff, that really is convincing to you, like when it comes to the footprints and just like, what is it that really is like, okay, this is credible and this is something to take out of that people should look for?
Well, obviously the thing that really piqued my interest as a youngster, and it wasn't just a naive interest. I mean, at that age, I was 11, but I was a voracious reader. My parents were very supportive of my interests, and this was obviously before the internet and everything. And so I had the International Wildlife Encyclopedia set, and I would read those from cover to cover, anyway, my first exposure to the topic of Bigfoot was the Patterson-Gimlin film, and that was just emblazoned, and I was struck by what I saw. It was just so natural. I mean, it didn't strike me as a monster movie, as some sensation, in and of itself, a sensational contrivance. It was, I was looking at a creature walking in its habitat, basically, is what it.
Do you still have that opinion to this day, even after all of your years of experience and profession?
Even more so. I mean, even more so. That sort of set the base, the foundation, and then I always, when I did kind of the times that the interest peaked and waxed and waned, through the years before my professional involvement, I was kind of always kept that a bit at arm's length, because I felt like we shouldn't put all our eggs in that basket, because then if it should ever be exposed as a hoax, your whole facade, your whole edifice doesn't collapse.
Right.
I think that was unnecessary now, because eventually when I had the opportunity to examine some more recent footage, some video footage, and then was exposed to footprints in the field and really started immersing myself in the footprint record seriously. Even at first, I was always, the Patterson-Gimlin film, it was there, but let's not overdo it. That's not the holy grail. now I think it serves that purpose very well. I'm as convinced as I can be, short of having stood there on the sandbar on that afternoon, that it's the real deal. And I've looked at it every which way, and I've worked together and consulted with very knowledgeable people like Bill Munns, and more recently a young computer scientist, Isaac Tian, who's done some great treatments of the archive of copies of the film that Bill, with a minor contributions from me, as well as some financial support through some grants I was able to get to support Bill's research, has accumulated. I mean, it's an extremely valuable archive of images with, probably in some instances as many as a dozen copies of the film of various generation, which allows you, when if there's a particular feature on a particular frame, but you're not certain if what you're looking at is an artifact of the copy process, or you're maybe misinterpreting something, when you can look at 12 versions of that, and if it's consistent, then it probably is a real feature and not some artifact.
You can actually see if it's musculature flexing in the calf instead of like a fleck of dust on the lens or something like that. Yeah, okay.
And then Isaac's technique of superimposition, he writes computer algorithms that allow you to perfectly line up these frames based on well-established landmarks. And when you superimpose all of those, it nullifies the grain artifacts. Some of your listeners may not know what I'm talking about here when it comes to grain, film grain, but prior to the digital age, where we have individual pixels, individual quanta of data that remain consistent from copy to copy, file copy to file copy, when you transferred an image from a film emulsion that had halide crystals, silver crystals that would react to the light, each copy, each new film had a slightly different texture of crystals. And so it can distort or change or blur an edge with each copy, or with subsequent copy. And of course, the details break down with each additional iteration. But when you summate that information back, it reinforces the consistent message and diminishes the anomalous features. And so what jumps out at you is much clearer, reduces the scratches and flecks and dust and so forth, and artifacts like the famous little circle that people have interpreted as the OK sign by the hand of Patty, which is nothing but an artifact of the copying, a blemish.
Oh, really? It's just the hand is
the hand. You can only see the back of the hand. There's no fingers. That palm doesn't. This is what's so funny. It makes it look like
that's stuck in
like an Egyptian. Yeah. With the back hand turned way back like this.
Right.
And here's a real giveaway for why I'm absolutely certain that Bob Hieronymus is just full of it. Yeah. Is when he tries to, quote, imitate the walk, or when he walks in order to show that his walk is like Patty's. What does he do? He turns his hand around in a very unnatural direction, so the palm's facing backward, curls his fingers, and he walks like that. Well, he's trying to imitate what he's seen on the film, on the version of the film that he's familiar with.
Which in the end kind of is a giveaway, because the fact that he's trying to emulate with his hand something that the video evidence ultimately reveals was just an artifact of film grain, then he is trying to cup his hand based on something that never happened in the video.
That's right.
He's trying to imitate something based off of an artifact. So he probably was not in a suit out there.
Oh, I'm certain. I'm certain that's the case. But it's a dead giveaway.
Faking the tracks and everything out there that were cast and everything is another thing too.
Yeah. And I've said repeatedly, if all I had to go on were the casts, were the footprints from the site, it would be extremely compelling, because I mean, it has that remarkable example of the mid-tarsal pressure ridge, not only the one that where it's extremely distinct, but Bob Titmus cast 10 in succession, and subsequently in the film itself, images have been identified back in the herky-jerky beginning frames that show where the creature walked up onto the sandbar, and the footprints are quite distinct, and there are several that have every bit as dramatic a pressure ridge. But we did three-dimensional scans of those 10 casts done by Bob Titmus, and when you examine them, and I've examined the casts firsthand and confirmed this obviously as well, but for other people to see, people have asked, well, if this is a real feature, if Meldrum's interpretation of the foot is accurate, why don't the other footprints show any evidence of that? Well, all you have to do is turn them so you're looking at them sideways, and boom, there's the pressure ridge in 9 of the 10 casts. I mean, you don't expect to find them in every single one. Roger looked for the cleanest, flattest, crispest examples that he could cast, and so as a result, they looked remarkably flat, and so much so that the experts at the time basically said, "Well, these look artificial. They look like they were carved out of a wooden plank, basically, which was the fallback position." Right. But the others show remarkable dynamics, and then on top of that, well, I made allusion to the Chinese footprints. That was the real giveaway, because it was so funny. And I've told this story, and so bear with me if you listeners have heard it. But when we were there in China, and we were going to do an interview with a witness who had a pair of casts that he had made, and they wouldn't let me look at it until we had the interview set up so they could capture my initial reaction and comments on film. And so we were driving out to a location where they wanted to sort of orchestrate, cast a series of interviews. And on the way, I had given Mr. Yuan, the witness, a copy of an article I had written, a paper I'd published, which had a very nice figure, a photographic figure showing three-dimensional scans of this Titmus cast with a distinctive pressure ridge, showing it at various angles so you could really appreciate the topography. And he couldn't understand the English, he couldn't read it, but boy, he saw that image, and he got excited. Oh, look at, and I said, okay, yeah, we'll sure enough, we get to the location, get set up, get the cameras rolling. He opens up his little suitcase, and out come these two casts, and they're dead ringers for that cast that he got so excited about. I mean, every proportion and detail, and I was just floored. I mean, here's how could he possibly? Why, even if he had some access to an image like that which I showed him previously, why would he think to imitate that? Why would he presume to? And then get the perfect bilateral symmetry, on the two opposite feet with exactly the same proportions. And because so many people, I've had so many people, not that many. There have been times when people have tried to doctor a would-be footprint, real or not, by adding this feature, and of course they get it all wrong. They don't know the anatomy, they don't know the positions of the joints, the relative proportions, and so forth. But then I was going to add, I subsequently had the chance to look at the famous Jerry Crew cast from 1958, that first cast essentially in the United States anyway, that made the headlines. And unfortunately, when that newsprint photo was shot, he used a very strong flash. You can see the real heavy shadow behind Jerry on the wall. And that, when you flash that much, I mean, it's a great photo, but it really flattens the features. And so subsequently, I had a chance to visit with Jerry Crew's son, who is the custodian of that original cast, and he had it wired in this nice shadow box and the image from the newspaper clipping and so forth there. And he was kind enough to untwist the wires and allow me to take the cast out and examine and photograph it. Well, now it had been subsequently cleaned a little bit better too. The toes were more distinct. A lot of the matrix had been, the soil had been cleaned away. But boy, all of a sudden you look at it in a side light, there's a pressure ridge in exactly the right position, in exactly the right, orientation.
Which is something that they wouldn't have known because they're not an
No.
anthropologist specializing in bipedal locomotion.
Even the anthropologist of that day
Right.
would probably not. See, I have there's a few anthropologists out there who are familiar with Hickman's papers and his description of the mid-tarsal break. It was just an observation that was made back in I think it was the 30s, where he was describing the movements, the kinematics of a chimpanzee walking quadrupedally and bipedally. And he noted this greater degree of flexibility through the instep.
Right.
And that drew attention to this, and he referred to it as the mid-tarsal break. It's not as evident. The gorillas have a stiffer foot. They're because of their size, their foot just doesn't have the same degree of flexibility, although they don't have a fixed longitudinal arch. But in other primates, there's a considerable range of motion there. And anyway, even now, I still have trouble with some of my colleagues accepting the correlation of that description, that kinematic, with what is evident on the Sasquatch foot. But see, you can watch the Patterson-Gimlin film, and you can see the action of the foot. We have not only the footprint record and my interpretation based on the inferences about the dynamic and the artifacts that are as a result of that dynamic interaction of the foot with the substrate, but we can watch the track maker laying down those prints. We can see the heel elevate and flex across the instep. We can see the recoil as the foot swings, and the midfoot flexes in the opposite direction. And then we can even see the toes dorsiflex as the foot swings out and contact is made. Not a real heel strike, but just as you would expect with such a foot where there's more even initial contact of the foot over the entire substrate. Most of those tracks don't have a real distinctive heel impression. The ones that Roger cast, are remarkably flat because the foot is coming down flat. There's not a heel strike and a toe off at the other end of an arch. I mean, it's so obvious. I mean, I get kind of worked up here because it's like,
well, we want to everybody wants to relate it to themselves, like, because humans incorrectly a lot walk with the heel strike first, but something walking bipedally on difficult terrain and steep terrain is going to be up on the balls of their feet a lot and adapted to have that mid-tarsal hinge and feature and everything to adapt to that environment.
Exactly. It's a great adaptation for walking up steep slopes.
Yeah, and that flat-footedness.
Why would it be like that? Well, on the flat, it's not such an advantage, but when you're negotiating, I mean, just imagine what it's like when you're trying to go up a steep slope in stiff hiking boots. We usually resort to switchbacks where our foot is on the side, or we walk up sideways kind of, but rarely do you kick your toes in. I mean, you see that with someone wearing crampons going up a glacier, but not on a hillside so much, a steep hillside. And it the other explanation in my mind is the lack of the arch doesn't concentrate excessive forces on the toes, bending forces during toe off. If the push off is coming from the entire forefoot, then you spare the toes those bending stresses that have selected for remarkably short toes in humans, and you still have this much more prehensile foot, which we see again when you look at the Patterson film. It's so it's so counterintuitive if this were a hoax, because from the sole side, the toes look short and stubby. just like little toe tips on the pads. But when
Right.
that foot dorsiflexes, those toes are really long.
And you see the toes go up.
Yes, yeah, you
I've
see them point up.
stabilized. Yeah, I've
And sure
stabilized the
enough,
footage
you
and
know,
zoomed in. Yeah.
it corresponds to the hint of a flexion crease that's present across the ball of the foot of Patty, with a lot of webbing up between the toes, but they're still remarkably flexible. You know, and sometimes you get that crease that shows up. Other time, or it may just show up here on the outer edge where the sole pad is bound, you know, to the underlying tissue.
Yeah.
But when the weight is pressed on that thick sole pad, it tends to expand laterally and push out all the creases. That's why the feet look, you know, why do the feet look so flat? Well, have you ever looked at an elephant's foot?
Right.
The sole pad of the elephant foot, you know, when it steps, it squashes out, and any creases or grooves that were in that sole pad just get flattened out, stretched out, and the imprint of the foot is remarkably featureless, except for the nails of the toes up at the other end.
And we're talking about a creature that would be walking through heavy, deep snow a lot of the time too, which would make sense to that type of spreading action, almost like a snowshoe adaptation for the foot up in that type of environment. Would make sense. Crawling over slippery rocks or rivers and all kinds of stuff, it would make sense.
Certainly.
There's a great comment here Sapphire Elf has, with the mid-tarsal break in the foot that Dr. Meldrum has discovered, does that point to Bigfoot being more like a great ape and not from the genus Homo? So does the mid-tarsal break indicate more of it being more like a great ape or on the animal kingdom and less in the Homos?
That's a great question, and early on, as this started to take focus, I wondered if that would be a discriminating feature that would compel, you know, considering it to be more ape-like. But then, as I started, you know, these insights caused me to go and look at the footprint record of early hominins more carefully, and so there were some interesting features that surfaced with the famous Laetoli hominid footprints from East Africa, which are attributed to Australopithecus afarensis, or Lucy, and her kind. And there is evidence of a pressure ridge, and it's a long story, but it's fascinating. But wrangling with other anthropologists, I mean, on the one hand, there were some that said, you know, these footprints are in gloppy, wet volcanic ash. You can't interpret anything about them. And I said, well, maybe you can't.
Right.
You just need to open your eyes and look at the anatomy. I mean, there's all kinds of anatomical detail. In some of those prints, you can see individual toe tips. You know, there is that much detail there. And then others, on the other hand, try to explain away, you know, like one person said, well, there were terrestrial termites that would burrow like a gopher, you know, and heap up a mound. And he said they were probably just the termite mound where a termite colony had crossed the tracks. Well, I pointed out several tracks that had the exact same feature, which is in the exact place that his own reconstruction of the foot skeleton placed the mid-tarsal joint. And I said, okay, so you're telling me that these independent termite colonies have crossed perpendicular to the footprint line and transected multiple examples of footprints at exactly the same place?
Yeah.
I said, you know, that's a little... you know, okay. Oh, well, then they were artifacts. They were excavation artifacts. You know, Mary Leakey
and it still doesn't even answer to the question as to what made the entire footprint to begin with for a termite to crawl across. It's strange to me.
Well, they had no question that they were made by hominins, but his point was simply the ones that were saying that you couldn't interpret. they were
I
intended,
see.
you couldn't interpret any details of anatomy.
These are actually known hominid footprints. We're not the Bigfoot ones that you're looking at today.
Oh,
I
right.
see.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
these
Okay.
were
Yes.
hominin footprints in the volcanic ash,
Gotcha.
the ossified volcanic ash. But the point being that there is remarkable evidence. Well, the real clincher was I went to Berkeley, and Tim White has some of the best, at least accessible documentation of the Laetoli tracks. Now, subsequently, they've been 3D scanned and all kinds of things, but at the time, he had these remarkable sets of stereoscopic photographs, and he had this really nice set of stereo viewers that you could put up and look at these images, and they literally just jumped out of the tabletop at you.
Mm.
And they had done a complete set. This track ran roughly north and south, so they did a complete set in the mid-morning and a complete set from the mid-afternoon. So the light was complementary, and you could look at the two sets, and what was in shadow in the morning was now in daylight in the afternoon, and there was no lost information. But boom, I mean, the features just jumped out at you, and there was a lot of detail there that had never been otherwise well documented and published. There were photogrammetric, kind of like topographic maps done of the trackways, all kinds of errors and misrepresentations there that gave misleading interpretation or impressions of the anatomy of the foot. So I had a chance to really look at this carefully. And then he pulls out 3 or 4 casts, including this beautiful cast that had never been published, of a footprint that had not simply a ridge of kind of extruded or mounded up ash, but it had what I would describe as an extrusion front, where the ash was especially wet, and so it squeezed out. There were examples where ash had squeezed up between the rather prominent gap between the first and second toes, and it extruded up like this, and then it under its own weight, it fell over, and it left this very distinctive looking rounded edge of this extruded mud. Well, what we were seeing, midway back on the track here, was the mud extruded from under the forefoot after the heel had come up. Not just a ridge, but an actual extrusion. For the point, reason I'm emphasizing this is it was absolutely pristine. There was no chance that this was where they had flaked off an extra layer with a fracture line or something coincidentally at that particular point, and it fell at exactly the same point as our supposed termite mounds, on the other tracks. And then there was a secondary one as the foot rocked forward. There was that kind of final push off from the heads of the metatarsals. There was another smaller secondary extrusion with the exact same configuration and conformation. So, okay, so back to the original question now. So does this suggest more ape-like or more hominin-like? Well, I've got evidence, and I've published on this extensively, and I tell you, it's like beating your head against the wall, because there is a group, there are individuals out there who push the agenda that these hominins were just little humans, basically, and that once they were bipedal, they walked bipedally like little humans. And so they don't want to acknowledge that the arch was a very recent innovation, right? Probably not well, and it was a mosaicism too. It wasn't just from flat foot to arch foot. There was first an increased stability of the outer column of the foot between the heel bone and the cuboid in front of it, and then gradually the foot became more with the non-divergence of the big toe. The medial arch started to take shape and was more pronounced. But even up till the immediate predecessor of us and Neanderthals, say, which still is called Homo heidelbergensis. It's a very broad. It's now been partitioned. There was a great article with the discovery of the Harbin skull that really kind of sorted some of this out. But the point being, that creature had an arch, albeit a low, very broad arch, a low arch with on a broad, robust foot, much more robust than ours, and so it was shared by us, who refined it even more as our skeleton became lighter and we became lean, mean running machines versus Neanderthals, who were the the bull riders.
Right.
And I say that, but there was actually a study done where they looked at the healed injuries, fractures, and so forth of the skeletons attributed to Neanderthals, and the type, the nature, and distribution of the injuries most resembled. They compared it to human occupations, and it most resembled bull riders.
What?
At rodeos, yeah, bull riders.
Really?
So in other words, Neanderthals were not out there, riding the bull, but they were in close with weapons that required them to be grappling hand to hand with some of these big Pleistocene fauna.
Wow.
And as a result, had the kinds of broken wrists and pelvic fractures and things that were associated with bull riding. So again, circle back. See, I'm terrible at digression.
No, it's great.
Circle back, in the words of Jen Psaki, and the original question is: there's evidence of flat, flexible feet characterizing the early hominid form of bipedalism all the way up until at least Homo erectus at about anywhere from 1.5 to 2 million years ago.
Right.
And so our arch is a fairly recent innovation. There was some work done by Jeremy Da Silva, I think it was, where he thought he was taking a pot shot at my placing significance on the evidence of the mid-tarsal break in early hominins by. He went out. He literally the initial data he collected. He went to a shopping mall. I don't know how he did this with human subjects restrictions, but he set up a pressure plate and had people walk barefoot on this and measured their the profile of their step and could visualize the degree of development of their arch, and found out of some 30 or 40 subjects there were 1 or 2 or 3 that had a remarkable degree of flexibility through. They had rather what we would call flat mobile feet, hypermobile feet. And so he said, there, you see, even modern humans. And I said, well, no, wait a minute, you're drawing the completely wrong conclusion. The fact that there are still some modern humans that show that primitive trait suggests that it's not a very well-established trait, does it? It means that it's a very recent vintage. And so you've just confirmed what I've been saying all along. Yeah. That yes, we would expect to see a fair amount of variation in the expression of this trait, for which natural selection has had only a short period of time to solidify and to, even if you ignore all the potential pathologies to explain the expression of that kind of flexibility.
Yeah.
So it's a very recent innovation. So Bigfoot could be on either side. It could be an ape that has converged on bipedalism in a similar fashion as early hominins have, and given its massive size, I mean, once it's on the ground, because an 800-pound gorilla has no business climbing in a tree.
Right.
Once it's on the ground, there's basically two options. You either are on all fours or you're bipedal. And the reconfiguration of the shoulder girdle, the things about the upright trunk that had selected for bipedal-like behaviors and anatomies in these Miocene apes before would be present in Gigantopithecus and its ancestry, or some other species that could have become gigantic during the Pleistocene, as did so many other northern latitude mammals. Or if bipedalism, if Sasquatch bipedalism is uniquely shared with early hominins or hominins, then I would say, again, given the lack of any material culture, any stone tools, it would have to be a very early divergence off of that family tree, near the root, so to speak, of the hominin radiation, something like a Paranthropus. And that's where this comparison of the Paranthropus skull to Patty is so remarkably interesting. She shows the specializations or the disproportionate development of the lower face, the deep jaws, the flat face, the very forward flaring cheekbones for the massive chewing muscles, and the lack of a frontal, just the skull going back.
Right.
Anyway, it's
that is what's fascinating, and it does a lot of times does come back to Patty, and it's so interesting because I have stabilized that footage and zoomed in on the foot, and what blew my mind is, like you're saying, even when the foot's coming up, I'm like, okay, if this is like an extended foot in a rubber costume,
right.
how are the toes flexing upward for the next
Right.
step? And then you stop and you scan up and you're like, and when the toes are flexing up, how come the appropriate musculature up in the quadriceps and things seem to be flexing?
Oh yeah.
And then when it's pushing off from the back leg, why is the calf muscle flexing? And you can see musculature in the back and the shoulders when it turns, and as the quality of the footage has come out, as the source footage has come forward, I have, as somebody who's been involved in stabilizing footage and clarifying it since like 2009, I can't find like where this is a guy in a suit, and it boggles my mind. I agree with you 100%. And the footprints too, all the footprint images and the castings and stuff, some of them even seem to have like indications of toenails and like toe prints, or indications of, I'm not what do you call them, on the fingerprints on your toes?
Sure. Yeah, dermatoglyphics, skin ridge detail. Yeah,
skin ridge details and some of the finer ones. But you're saying that even ones that people, like, if I encountered a track that might be considered to me deformed or not worth it, someone like you might look at it as an expert and see a way more useful information than something that would be assumed as like a pristine track.
Oh, exactly.
It's just flat, because then you're seeing actual locomotion and pressure and weight and movement and all that stuff in what we might consider a botched track or something.
Right. Oh, exactly. Okay. When Paul Freeman took me out to show me the tracks that he had found that morning, this was what he was saying. He said, I've got so many tracks, so many casts rather. He said, I wouldn't even bother casting these. I don't make casts unless they're very exceptional footprints. And I get out there and look at these, and I'm thinking just the opposite, because and just as you're pointing out, what he sees as imperfections or incompleteness is actually the telltale signs of an animate foot varying as it interacts with the substrate under successive conditions and speed of walking and direction of turning. I mean, there were all these dynamics of an animated foot that were just amazing. And as it was, I only was able to make 7 casts, but those 7 casts preserved a wide range of dynamic features that were very informative. So
there are a few comments here from the audience here asking a little bit more information about some of the deformed footprints that you've seen. So here's one of like the deformed feet that have evidence of healing after being crushed. And then also a question from John Q, maybe that could piggyback that, about maybe fatty deposits and things like that could be changing foot profiles, or
both those are fascinating. The first one, I mean, of course, the classic example is the Bosberg cripple foot, which has always fascinated me. I mean, that was the example that really tipped the scale in Dr. Krantz's mind, because the inference of anatomy that was possible from that confirmed some aspects of foot proportion and function that he had drawn attention to, namely the elongation of the heel. This was a detail that was misconstrued and has been perpetuated even by people like Dr. David Daglin in some of his writings, that where Grover talked about the movement of the ankle forward on the foot. Well, what he meant was simply not that the ankle actually moved, because Daglin should have known better. Went on and on about how ridiculous this is. How can the joint actually move forward in the foot? Well, it's proportionately further forward, i.e., the heel is elongated. The heel is elongated to increase the leverage because with the foot still flexible in the instep, you don't have the advantage of leverage out here in the forefoot. The fulcrum of the lever is at the transverse tarsal or mid-tarsal joint.
Right.
And so with increased body mass, the only way to accommodate that is to increase leverage by increasing the length of the heel, which makes the ankle look like it's farther forward on the foot. The heel juts out, the forefoot seems proportionately narrower, or shorter rather, but there's no movement of the ankle joint. But you can see that on Patty too. And this also led into another misconception, which was when she lifted her foot, and she's swinging, and now the tension on the Achilles tendon, the calcaneal tendon, is slackened, or lessened. Then the tendon slackens, and the heel seems to be more prominent, more protruding. And Daglin actually shows a frame which depicts this to the extreme, and says, well, look, it's the artificial foot jutting back beyond the costume wearers.
Yeah, they think that's evidence of a costume foot, when
Right.
really it's evidence of the size and the mass of something bipedal. That's immense.
Yes, and all you have to do is look ahead to a frame where the weight is on the foot and the calf musculature is contracting, and the tendon is as straight as can be off of the heel. There's no slack, there's no protrusion. It's perfect. So I mean, it's silly. But back to this cripple foot, Grover noticed that the relative positions of these very prominent bunionettes, these bulges, inflamed joints on the outer edge of the foot, were farther forward than they would be in a human foot.
Right.
Because the heel was disproportionately elongated. So that corroborated. Well, I had the good fortune of actually being invited to speak at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, and the entire podiatry and a number of orthopedists from the hospital, and then also podiatrists from the community part of this group were invited. There was probably 50 to 70 people in attendance, all professionals, so I could really talk shop. And I talked about all these biomechanical aspects of the functional morphology of the foot, showcasing the cripple foot. Right. And they were just amazed. I mean, they didn't have a dog in the fight. They didn't have an agenda. And so they were simply looking at the anatomy. Exactly. There you go. Looking at the anatomy, and were extremely impressed. And this very animated conversation ensued with many of them, and carried on afterward about what the interpretation of this was. And that was one possibility, that it was a healed, crushed foot from a crushing injury. Another possible interpretation is that there was a neuropathy, a lesion on the spinal cord that caused deformation of the foot downstream, down the nerves. And that one that was suggested by a relative of mine, a distant second or third cousin, another Meldrum, Russell Meldrum, who went into orthopedic surgery and became a hip and knee specialist. But I imposed upon him for his opinion on this, sent him that very photo that you showed that has the two yardsticks clearly visible.
Yeah.
And, he was looking at that, and he was quite impressed. And he said he thought it was not a congenital deformity, because typically that would involve both feet. But he said, so it was either a crushing injury or a spinal neuropathy. He goes, could you check in that area? He said, this was back before the days of HIPAA and FERPA and all confidentiality. So could you check with a hospital? That was a pretty small town. If I had a patient like this, I would refer them to have a spinal MRI to check their health of their spinal cord. And I said, well, I might be able to do that, possibly, but I said, you do realize, Russell, the guy would have to have 17-inch feet.
Yeah.
And there's this pregnant pause on the line. He goes, oh, you're right. You're right. I mean, he was so preoccupied with the anatomy, which was very satisfying, very logical, very rational, that he completely missed the two scales in the. So then I get a call about 2 weeks later, and his boss, who was the foot specialist of the group, had returned from a vacation and had seen these, and he calls me up. We talked about their interpretation at length, and then his closing statement was what was really noteworthy. I mean, all the rest was as well, but this is the part that I always remember. But he said, I hope you don't mind, but I imposed on Russell that he let me have the photo that you sent him, and I have it framed now, and it hangs in my office on my wall above my desk. And every few months, when I get a new set of interns to take on rounds, this is the first case I have them evaluate.
Oh man.
So
it's an unsolvable equation. That one.
Yeah. Now there was the second question about fat deposits.
Yeah.
It's kind of tricky when you're dealing the fat that's in your sole pad is some of the last fat to be metabolized in starvation. If you see these little children in Africa with the round bellies and spindly limbs, if you notice, they still have a reasonable fat pad on the soles of their feet, but eventually it does start to wane. And what's interesting is the tracks that I cast in 1996 were in February. They were the first tracks of the spring. Now, we don't know if these creatures hibernate or estivate or hole up for any period of time during the dead of winter in these areas, but it's a very good possibility. And even if they don't, pickings are probably pretty lean during the winter months until that green up starts and thaw starts. One of the things that's interesting is these footprints, which are about the same size as Patty's, they're just under 15 inches, whereas Patty clearly has a very visible, thick, healthy pad, and she looks very robust, has pendulous breasts that are probably, well, she could well be lactating. I shouldn't say are mostly fatty tissue. Her buttock could have a lot of fatty tissue on it. She looks rather cut and muscular elsewhere. You can pick out muscle groups quite readily, but her sole pad looks really thick, really fleshy.
Right.
In contrast, the tracks that I cast there in southeastern Washington, you can actually see some of the bony features. There's a discernible little bulge that is right under the point of contact between the calcaneus and the cuboid. And if you hold up a foot skeleton, you can see that tuberosity. It forms a real important attachment point for the deep plantar ligament, which would be more evident in a flat foot, not in an arched foot. Right, but it suggests that perhaps that sole pad is a little more meager and thinner, such that some of those bony features in that soft mud actually made some contact and
might have been struggling to find food. That one was a little thinner,
probably,
or something.
Yeah. I mean, see, that's what we think it was doing. It was down out of the high country on that farming, along those farming roads, because right in that vicinity there are abandoned plum and apple orchards, old pioneer orchards, and the fruit is still accumulated. Sometimes it's kind of rotten, but if it's frozen over winter, just thawing out now, it can still be gleaned in those early spring thaw months or weeks.
Right. So there's still some residual crops that grow up there that they come in and are acquainted with. Yeah.
Right. Because otherwise the fields are pretty fallow and everything else is buried. The only thing that holds its fruit up above the snow line is hawthorn berries.
Right.
And they're harder and harder to find. The ranchers tend to get rid of them because they have those deadly, not deadly, but those wicked long thorns which the cattle get into, and if they get poked in the eye, it causes an infection that can be very problematic, if not fatal.
That's interesting. Well, Dr. Meldrum, before we wrap this up, I'm sure everybody's really interested to hear some of your personal stories or encounters that you've had. In fact, this one even goes a little bit further. You can answer this one if you want or not in this much detail, but has Dr. J had any orb or UAP experiences, like UFO experiences around Bigfoot habitats? So you can answer that one. And then I would love to hear some of your personal encounters that might be plausible Bigfoot encounters that you've had.
I've not had anything associated with Bigfoot. I mean, my closest UFO or UAP, whatever you want to call it now, experience was back in my college years, where I took a real interest in the constellations and stargazing, and even when I was a kid. I mean, that's sort of a carryover from when I was a kid. We had a big sun deck sticking out the back of our home, and it was real common for all the kids on the block, and there were a lot of kids on the block. During the summers, frequently we would have sleepovers, and all our sleeping bags spread out, and sit and watch the stars and look for satellites going over. And we were really good at finding or watching satellites, and of course the occasional shooting star. And so I was familiar with what a satellite looks like. But on this occasion, there was an object which, instead of that kind of oblique path across from kind of northwest to southeast, sort of, or something like that, this thing was going due north to south, and suddenly executed 2 right-angle turns. I mean, just as sharp as if you put a square on there. And it just jaw dropped. I thought, well, there's nothing that I can think of, because it was way up there. It was tiny, so it was moving along quite fast, and then to make such an abrupt. But no Bigfoot associated with that, and no orbs. You know, I've asked a lot of people about orbs, about their experiences, and people have shared. The most recent one, where I pressed the matter home a bit, and I said, well, don't you have any pictures to back this up? I mean, something that's not obviously a flash flare or reflection or something like that. He goes, oh, sure, I've got lots of pictures. And I said, well, send me your best one. I always have to emphasize that, because invariably people will send me pictures of things, footprints or whatever, and I'll say, I'll have some criticism or some question, some caveat, and they get a little defensive, and then they go, oh, well, I've got better pictures than that. Well, why didn't you send your best ones?
Why didn't you send the best
I don't
one?
understand this logic. This happens over and over. I guess they're keeping it close to the vest. They don't want to show their whole hand right off the bat. But in any case, this fellow finally agreed. Not finally, it didn't take persuasion, but he agreed, and he sent me pictures. Well, I get the picture. It's a flash photo at night at a camp spot, and the air is full of pollen.
Yeah.
And he said, and I go, what am I looking for? And he goes, oh, they're all over. You can't miss them. There's little yellow orbs just floating all over in the air. I said, that's pollen. I said, I've been in those circumstances. Just that summer, I had been up in the Colorado Rockies, and it was predominantly ponderosa pine that I was familiar with from when I was a kid. And in that pollen, they over-pollinate. They overdo it.
Yeah.
And so to where pollen is piled up in, like drifts of snow. And when it's blowing through the air, I remember stepping out of my tent and, to go take care of business with my headlamp on, and I turned my headlamp on, and I couldn't see. It was a whiteout. It was like a blizzard.
Like Star Wars.
Blowing everywhere. And that's what he sent me a picture of. So I don't rule out these quote unquote paranormal experiences or phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's just that it seems that whenever I'm present, they disappear. they don't make an appearance.
Right.
And so I don't know. I can't. Obviously, I'm not inclined to take people at their word that I don't. People that I don't know from Adam.
Sure.
And I have no gauge of their not only not even an issue of credibility, but just their ability to interpret their experiences. I've learned this from footprints as well. when people claim to have seen footprints, unless they've documented it, or unless they are extremely experienced, and are of a skill set that qualifies their opinion to be reliable, I can't take them at their word, because when in so many instances when they do have pictures, it's a pothole, or it's a bear track, or it's a human footprint. We've got just a real proliferation of extraneous data that I'm constantly sifting. People accuse me of being gullible. They have no idea how much chaff I sift through, that I discount, or that I try to. I'm an educator, so I try to take the opportunity to teach, and in some cases, the individuals have also allowed me to post examples, so I can show how would you evaluate this, and here's what I've come up with. Does anyone have any other ideas, or does this help you to interpret things in the future? So that's that. As far as personal experiences, I've heard vocalizations on probably a half a dozen different occasions, things that I think are attributable.
Yeah.
I mean, short of a good recording subjected to a sonographic interpretation, it's a very subjective kind of thing. But I've tried to educate myself, expose myself to as many variations of vocalizations, and some that quite frequently surprise me. I had no idea that this animal could make a noise like that, until you hear it. And I can understand how someone in the field hearing that for the first time would be quite, disquieted over that sound. I've found tracks on at least a half a dozen occasions, sometimes in extremely remote places where the chance of someone hoaxing is virtually, can be discounted, which then leaves it is my interpretation of the track accurate. And people have to remember that there's a quite a spectrum of quality of trace evidence, and not everything is as clear and pristine as the tracks that I use to demonstrate the points, which I'm very confident in. And there's, it's either or. It either is hoaxed or it's the real. I mean, like the tracks I saw in '96, they were either real or they were hoaxed. There was no misinterpretation. They weren't bear tracks. They weren't human tracks. They weren't potholes in the mud. They were footprints. And so I think that I'm capable of telling the difference between an animated trackway and a line of stomped artificial impressions.
Yeah.
The closest thing to, well, I've had a couple of close encounters. One that I go into some detail in my book in the introduction. My first field research expedition, if you will, but field research I prefer, in the Six Rivers National Forest. We were just north of the Patterson-Gimlin film site. And just over the ridge from Bluff Creek is Blue Creek, and that the headwaters of that drainage, and then they lead up into the Six Rivers Wilderness. Very remote and not often traveled, because it's not as scenic as the northern end of that wilderness area, which gets much more backpacking traffic. We were there for a month and didn't see. Well, we saw one pair passing through. Just a brief glimpse. They didn't stop. They didn't want to go. We were a pretty raunchy looking group by that time, after 3 weeks in the field with rather Spartan rations and rough accommodations, and smelled like llama dung.
Right.
But on that trip we had something come into camp, and it made for an exciting something which did leave traces. I mean, left footprints, not super distinct because they were in grass and or a boggy effluent next to a spring, but brushing against the tent, kind of like, I think it was counting coup, running right past my tent, dragging its fingertips along the fly.
Really?
So you see the tent respond to it, and that footprint right alongside. and
Wow.
rifling through our backpacks. And then more recently, I had an experience up in Alberta, Canada, which I guess was just on TV recently because someone here at school mentioned it to me, mentioned seeing it. But it was with Todd Standing. So it was a very controversial, has become, let's see, at the time it wasn't controversial. I mean, it was equivocal.
Yeah.
I was skeptical of what he had, some of the data he'd presented, but wanted to, take him up on his offer to come up there and see one of his study sites and look at some of the terrain and the evidence that he was finding firsthand. And which included, we witnessed 13.5-inch tracks in the moss. We saw some interesting tree breaks, which, again, the jury's out, and some tree structures, which I'm very reticent about. Tree structures in general, I think it's a lot of things are overinterpreted, and my standard requires that there be some associative trace or physical evidence, footprints, hair, scat, something, handprints,
right,
that are go beyond just evidence of transport, as opposed to wind blow. But in any case, something approached camp on the last night I was there, and Dr. Bindernagel was there as well. We heard a vocalization. It kind of a whistling call. This was about 2:30 a.m. Something approached camp, stayed just outside the firelight. We had a big, bonfire kind of going, a campfire, and we were staying up late, hoping to attract things into camp like this very thing. It circled camp, breaking brush, sounded like a bull moose, given the breakage that we were hearing. And one person walked approached the source of the sound, speaking reassuringly, trying to get a interaction, and was getting, she would speak and it would break a branch in immediate response. And then it broke. It sounded like Matt Moneymaker breaking his Louisville Slugger across a tree trunk, just crack. And I'm watching through a night vision monocular, and from near the fire there, and I could see her standing there. And when that crack, reported, her legs started to shake. So she backtracked away from it, and I had to shift the smoke shift, and I shifted position just as I moved. Because it didn't know we had night vision, whatever it was, or whoever didn't know I had night vision, and so I'm sure it thought it was completely obscured.
Right.
But it broke from the deep dark shadows down in this little dry stream bed on the other side of a berm that we were camped against on the road, and crossed the road into the trees and shadows on the opposite side. And so I just saw it for that amount of time, and the berm obscured it. If you imagine Patty, but jet black as she's walking behind that flood debris, that's basically what I saw, but not nearly as clear. There was not a lot of ambient light. I didn't have an illuminator, and so there was a bit of snow, a bit of noise, that is, on the image. And my first reaction was to
wait, what?
try to repeat it by moving the thing, seeing if I just had seen a blur, a smear, an echo, a shadow of an echo, or an echo of a shadow or something. And I couldn't, and I almost didn't say anything, again, because I wasn't confident. I wasn't sure. I'm still not 100%, but I think it's better than 50-50. Given the circumstances, I decided, well, we should at least talk about it. And I want somebody, I knew I had to leave in the morning before sunup to make it back to my flight. And the sun didn't come up very early, that far north, that late in the year. And so I wanted them to really scrutinize that hillside, and which they did.
So you had
And
to
they
have
found
somebody.
what
You had to have somebody in the dark and the same night that you saw that go walk down in that same spot.
oh well, no, I wanted the next day. The next day
Oh,
they
okay. I was going to
found
say that
look
would
for
take
footprints.
some courage to go down there to reenact that right
Well,
after.
yeah, it would. It would, quite honestly, because it's interesting because that this was kind of the interesting thing is, I had this impression of it, and given what I saw, and that's the problem with the monocular is if everything's flattened, kind of like
Right.
looking through a telephoto lens, it foreshortens everything.
Right.
And I thought it was just on the other side of the berm. I thought it had come up right behind the berm, and which was only about 10 yards from us.
Hmm.
Well, when they were cutting sign, Todd was filming as they're looking there, and basically all they could hope to look for was crushed grass or broken twigs and things, to see if there was the evidence of something heavy having passed through there. The ground was too hard. The gravel bed of the road wouldn't take a track.
Yeah.
And as he's filming, he ultimately came to my lab and was showing me this film. And in the parts where he's filming, I'm thinking to myself, no, he's in the wrong place. He's way over on the other side of the creek. And I think it was right here behind the berm.
Hmm.
Well, they found and it was coming from the area that I thought it would have originated. It angled up, and sure enough, it did go across the road and behind these trees, just like, and they flagged that out. And then John Bindernagel walked it while Todd came back up to the point where I was standing and filmed him. Now, granted, you can do a lot of fudging, trying to recreate with different cameras and different lenses and so forth.
Sure.
But I mean, it gave the impression of what I saw, except John was on the other side, and whatever I saw was at least 1.5 feet taller than John. So it was much bigger, and that's why I thought it was so close, because
Right.
it was very big. And so even at that distance,
It
seemed like it was much closer than it really was.
right.
So, we'll never know. I mean, I'm almost reluctant because people will say, "Oh, he's just grasping at straws." It could have been anything. It could have been his imagination. It could have been a bear. Those weren't really tracks. It was, but we did see tracks.
I challenge anybody to go out in the dark under campfire light while you're looking at the campfire, and then you stand up and turn around and go look into the dark, and even use like really good night vision equipment that you could spend upwards of $1,000 on, and FLIR equipment, and go out there, even $3,000 to $5,000, and you're going to struggle. And these things are these encounters are unpredictable, and when
I know.
You know what I mean? And so I
really
really challenge anybody to even go out there and try to film a bear in the dark or anything like that. It's a difficult task. I've tried and tried and tried it. It's
exactly.
I
know.
It's a challenge to even get out into those remote environments and to put yourself in the right scenario, let alone to be really geared up and ready to capture something irrefutable, which is what everybody wants. What are your thoughts on you mentioned vocalizations? We're running almost up on 2 hours. Can you believe it or not?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It's been amazing. But what is your opinion on the vocalizations, like the Sierra sounds or the samurai chatter, that kind of thing?
Well, they're mixed. I mean, I'm fascinated by the sounds. I can remember, the first time. It's kind of interesting. I was in a little used bookstore, little closet of a used bookstore, and I pulled down this. I think it was an analog science fiction, science fact magazine, and I'm thumbing through it, and there in the back was an advertisement for the Sierra sounds. I mean, this was quite a long time ago. I was probably just a teenager at the time, and I ordered it. It was a 45 record, vinyl record.
Really?
In a sleeve, yeah. And it had the picture of the wiki up, and it had a picture of one of the footprints, and then it had a little narration, and here it was. And I was fascinated by it. The sounds sounded very pungent, very ape-like to me, the chatter, and in many respects. and especially the whistle I was always impressed with.
Right.
And that became even more so when I was researching Sasquatch legend meets science, and I was talking with and reading the reports from Dr. Benson, the bioacoustician from down in Corpus Christi, and it was he who planted the thought of infrasound in my brain.
Right.
When he made the comment that he wouldn't be surprised, based on what he was listening to, if these creatures weren't capable of producing infrasound. And I started doing some research, and I'd heard about the humpback whales and elephants communicating over long distances, but I had no idea how much had been done about how many different species had been documented using infrasound for various things, various means of communication and or intimidation or stunning their prey,
Right.
like in the case of the roar of a tiger, for example.
Right.
Anyway, so that was interesting because there's a whistle in there that has this kind of an overtone quality to it. This isn't necessarily infrasound. I mean, obviously we're hearing it, we're listening to it, but this idea of an overtone that was probably produced by the pharynx, and that got me interested in overtone singing. The Inuits and the throat singers of Juva, that get this thing going on as they chant their. It's really quite fascinating, and it made me wonder if they were capable. Maybe that was a quality which also gave them their presumably remarkable, potentially remarkable ability to imitate sounds.
Right.
Imitate other wildlife or imitate human voices.
Right.
So having said that, as I said, on the back of the record was a footprint, and it's an odd looking footprint. It looks like a swim fin. I mean, it's very triangular. The toes are like Vienna sausages, and you can't tell if it's a right or a left. They're just lined up identical to one another straight across the foot. It looks really odd. And at one point, Ron was gracious enough to send me a number of photographic images of various footprints and casts. There's a few out there in the public that are representative of those. And again, they look fake. I'll put it that way. They look fake to me.
The Sierra Sounds footprints look fake to you?
The ones that I've seen documented, cast and photographed, they either look fake or they look so abnormal they don't look anything like a typical Sasquatch footprint. Very, very, like I said, very triangular, toes just carbon copies of one another straight across the distal end of the foot, and so you can't tell whether it's a right or a left. You have no idea whether it's a right or a left foot.
Right.
And I expressed those concerns to Ron. He thought I was not giving them their just due. He said that they'd seen very good clear footprints, and there was no question that these were the real thing.
Yeah.
And so it just, that kind of cast a pall over it always. That's been lingering there. And then I have very differing opinions as to Scott Nelson's interpretations of what he's hearing. I fully acknowledge his credentials and respect his expertise, but had questions, some of the results. The notion that these creatures could somehow acquire a form of pidgin English is just beyond comprehension.
Yeah.
I mean, just imagine yourself being dropped in a foreign country. You're not allowed to make any direct contact. You're not allowed to have any two-way conversations. You can only listen to the occasional utterance or someone calling for their children to come in for dinner or something like that. And from that, you're going to generate a lexicon of foreign words that you're going to incorporate into your own articulate language. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. And then, I wondered, I've always wondered. I mean, I've had, for example, Native Americans tell me that these creatures can speak their language. For example, here I'm interacting with Shoshone and Bannock, and they say, "Oh yeah, they speak Shoshone. They speak our language." And I'm thinking, well, again, how is that possible?
Right.
And then Scott Nelson said something that really struck me. You add to that the fact that he hears certain words like food, and so he's interpreting that as the English word food. But when he played his recordings to one of his fellow cryptolinguists rather, who was Japanese, what did he hear? He heard Japanese homologs. He heard words that were as if it had picked up Japanese pidgin, terms.
So here,
I mean, so that to me was the answer. You hear what you are familiar with.
It's almost like an auditory Rorschach, like you're hearing the noises and your own perceptions interface with that and fill in all the gaps, which is what you get visually with these Bigfoot counters a lot of times too. In the dark, people seeing things, and then they, boom, they fill in the gap.
So whether it has a human-like nose, or one that's more upturned and flared like an ape, or other ethnicity, not so narrow and slender. So anyway, my point is simply, I don't mean to put Scott on the spot, but I did put him on the spot, and I pressed him and I said, "Hey, I want to get some of this published. I want to have the opportunity to have your conclusions evaluated by others, disinterested reviewers." And see, that's when I do the relic hominoid inquiry. When I get a submission, I don't send it to sympathetic reviewers, just to pro forma go through the motions of having a peer review. I look for, if it features tracking methods, I look for the most recent publications in animal tracking and telemetry, and who's publishing and where's the research being done. And I, make cold calls or emails, and I've yet to be turned. Well, I was turned down once, and it was legitimate. He sincerely said, "Look, this is really interesting, but I've got 5 papers I have to get reviewed before the end of the month. I cannot take another one on." But otherwise, it's given me the opportunity to network with other academics who otherwise would not probably taken a role or an active participation in this subject matter. But as a reviewer or a commentator, they will, offer that professional courtesy. And so I said, this would be a great opportunity to do that. He won't do it. He's declined entirely. And, and so anyway, like I said, these are not definitive declarations or refutations or anything like that. I'm rather agnostic on the subject. I find it of the Sierra Sounds. I find it fascinating. I know Ron very personally, and have interacted with him in numerous conferences where we've both appeared or spoken, and count him as a friend. Have a great deal of respect for him. I think that, again, some of his ideas about quantum physics, the application of quantum physics to the macro world, are a little unfounded. Put it that way, unfounded. But we disagree on those points, those tenets of his argument. But you asked for what I thought. Those are the thoughts that are bouncing around like pong balls in the pinball machine, or pinballs in a pinball machine, as I try to grapple with the various experiences associated with it.
It's amazing. There's so much that comes from so many different angles. You would think that there's a lack of evidence, but where you're sitting in your chair, you're inundated with evidence, and it's a matter of sifting through for that.
It is
that golden egg, that smoking gun, actually.
Yeah.
Which speaks to like the DNA stuff. What do you think of the DNA analysis and a lot of it that comes back? It seems to be like, man, we've got something. We've got all this collaborative evidence with tracks and everything, but then the DNA stuff seems to come back human. Do you think that's from contamination or maybe
Well,
a hominid connection?
Here's the thing on that, and I must preface it by saying that unfortunately the water has been muddied by the work of Melba Ketchum and to a degree by Brian Sykes as well.
I remember when all that was going on.
Perhaps not in the same spirit as Melba Ketchum, but nevertheless it has muddied the water, and I'll explain why. But setting those two aside for the moment, yeah, we get these repeated instances where if the specimen isn't immediately identified as some other animal, is basically what happened with Brian Sykes, we're left with more often than not, if DNA is recovered, you're right, it comes back as human, and it's explained as either being contaminant from handling the specimen, or it's simply misidentified human. I mean, humans shed hair, and they find a hair strand that's fallen off from somebody, and it persists. Hair persists in the environment for a long time. It's quite durable. But the third option, the third possibility that has been glossed over, and I've discussed this at length with numerous geneticists, is if, as we were talking about earlier, this question of pongid hominid, or hominin, if it is a hominin, then it's more closely related to us than any other living species of primate. And as such, with the acknowledgement that chimps are, depending on which paper you read, 94 to 98% identical to us, this could be 99% identical to us, or 0.5% identical to us.
Right.
In which case, if you're doing a cursory sample with a marker that's generally used to separate different classes of mammals, then are you doing enough to find those, 1 out of 1,000 or 1 out of or 1 out of 500 bases that, and they're not evenly distributed throughout the genome.
Right.
There'll be lots of stretches of DNA that is absolutely identical to us.
Right.
Just as chimpanzees. I mean, you can turn this around, and instead of saying, well, chimps and humans share 99% of their DNA. I mean, that sounds fine, but the implication is we are 98% chimpanzee. The difference is in the 2%.
Right.
That makes all the difference in the world. It can be one duplicated gene that has given us our tremendous brain size increase and intelligence and the ability to have communicate by articulate speech. Just one gene.
And that one gene sometimes isn't enough to stop that hunter from picking it up and holding the tissue sample right in his hand before he puts it in the bag.
That's right.
And contaminating it all wrong. So
right. So my question has been to these geneticists is, are we doing enough? Because most of the samples that have been tested aren't part of big studies. They are at least big, reliable studies. They're underwritten by a documentary production company, and so they do a very quick, cursory sample, and they plug it into the gene bank, and the data set kicks out the closest or the first match, which is human. There is no sample of Sasquatch or unknown North American primate in the gene bank.
Right.
And so, one of the geneticists I talked to said, "Oh, you're absolutely right." He said, "If I were doing it, if I had the time and the resources, I would do the entire mitochondrial genome and probably a dozen or so nuclear genes before drawing any conclusions whatsoever." Well, that starts to get pricey, and finding the lab that will do it. I've reached out, not that Todd Disotell hasn't done some great work, but I wanted to have more than just Todd's voice on this subject.
Yeah.
And I've reached out to a number of labs, same kind of thing. I went to the literature, who's publishing on on grade 8 DNA. And I found that, for example, I found several examples, but there was a great one, great collaborative effort that was focused on some faculty, I think it was the University of Washington. And I reached out to a couple of them and explained my situation and concerns. And they said, well, this is fascinating, but we wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole, basically, figuratively speaking, paraphrasing.
Yeah.
They, in this day and age where NSF, the rate of successful grant award is about 6%. The functioning of, especially a lab like that, it can't run without the reagents and without the consumables, the Eppendorf tubes and the pipetters and the tips and all the other stuff. They cannot risk anything that might jeopardize their funding stream. And so the good labs, they wouldn't, and a student's not going to take on the project because it's academic suicide. You couldn't, I would never let one of my students study the Bigfoot research or do Bigfoot research. I mean, they could do something. I always encourage students who contact me and youngsters, if you want to do what I'm doing, then what you need to do is you pick out an area of science that you can develop a passion for, whether that's fiber analysis, whether that's fingerprinting, whether that's bioacoustics or DNA or tracking or wildlife biology or whatever. Then you become one of the experts. You make a mark in your field and establish your credibility and reputation and get tenure if you're in academia and or some other form of job security. And then you turn your attentions to the subject matter from that position of expertise.
Right.
But otherwise, because I've seen it. I've seen examples where people thought they could navigate those waters, and
Yeah, and a lot of those organizations that are equipped in order to do the type of testing that would put a nail in the coffin on this topic, they're under so much scrutiny for the funding, and they're going under accreditation processes and all that kind of stuff, to where it's just not even worth the risk as a distraction in order to bring something like this into the lab. Everything is getting looked at so closely. It's just like they don't have the time.
And even if a reviewer or a critic, isn't blatant enough to directly criticize. See, what happened to me here was it reached a point where the front-on assault was backfiring. There was repercussions for that kind of behavior. So what was the next iteration was to ignore it, and by ignoring it, not only just not reacting to it, they would literally, in one of my review cycles, the committee literally ignored anything I had published regarding this topic, any scientific presentations at professional meetings, any publication, any book. And then they hold up my record where they have dropped out all these things and said, well, look how spotty his productivity is.
Yeah.
He hasn't been generating the kind of research that, someone seeking full professorship should have demonstrated.
Right.
And so, then I have to push back and say, well, look at
I'm doing all this other work.
Well, yeah, doing all this stuff, and these are peer-reviewed journals, articles. This book was reviewed by probably more people than would review a journal manuscript before the publishers took it to press.
Right.
And I had sent it out for comments to numerous people, beforehand. And anyway, it's so ridiculous. But I would never, I would never encourage a student to go down that path. And I can understand how even established scientists, you look at the pattern. Most of the academics who have turned their attention to this subject have done so upon reaching retirement.
Right.
And then, unfortunately, more often than not, they've been taken from us unexpectedly, prematurely, and haven't been able to make the, Grover had pancreatic cancer, and Dara Swindler died just unexpectedly just as we were going to start collaborating on a number of projects. I mean, I don't want to say naive. I was idealistic enough to jump into the deep end of the pool before I even had tenure.
Yeah.
And just about cost me my career as a result. So I can empathize with the poor treatment that Dr. Krantz received,
right,
as a result.
Well, hopefully those times are changing in the younger generation with the modern changes, with like shows like this and being able to do interviews, and the amount of coverage that you're able to get with your books and appearances on TV and going to conventions. Sure. Hopefully will create sort of an umbrella or like an icebreaker for the new generation to come behind and sort of feel a little bit more brave to approach these topics.
Well, I have seen signs of that, but the qualifier is it will take, as Kuhn said in his Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and the fellow who coined the term paradigm shift, he said very astutely that it may take an entire generation to completely pass. Yeah. See, that's the thing. It's not just the new generation coming up, but this generation now, which are the gatekeepers. They're the department chairs, the symposium organizers, the society presidents, etc. You know, as long as they're there, then they still have their thumb on what is considered orthodox and what is not. I predict it's another 10 years before the signs I've seen of upcoming young academics who show a fervor for and curiosity for this subject before they can freely pursue it. And by that time, they'll have their tenure. Between 5 and 10 years, those that I've interacted with will have tenure, and the gatekeepers will have turned over, and some fresh blood hopefully will be taking up those positions. But it's sad, it really is a sad commentary to our national political landscape is so ridiculous. I mean, it's like someone said, he felt like he was in the Matrix. Yeah. Or my wife says, I wake up and I feel like I'm in the Twilight Zone. It just doesn't seem real. But to see that same kind of stuff go on in academia, yes, even more extreme in some instances, personalities and dogmas and ideologies and agendas. It just, I resist the tendency to become cynical. I saw it in Dr. Krantz. You can see it in his writings. Just read his last chapter on the scientific establishment. And I remember when I read that, I thought, oh, it's a shame that he ends with such sour grapes, this really engaging book. Yeah. And now I can see where it was coming from. You reach a point where it's just like, what, why the purity, what's the word I'm after? Purity, I guess, is the best way. Just that pure scientific curiosity, that spirit of discovery and exploration is gone. It's just squashed by the politics of wrangling for dollars and jockeying for position and egos and so anyway.
It's all become about the special interests and the self-preservation anymore. Everybody is very scared of the call-out culture and
that's right. All the more so, yeah.
Anything that comes up is going to stick forever now, and so it takes a brave generation, like you said, maybe to come up next to face it, or some sort of some evidence to come forward.
Some breakthrough,
some breakthrough. Maybe the technology will catch up, with the camera technology and night vision and things like that.
Yeah, that's and there are some interesting possibilities on the horizon that I hope to take part in and help push. If I can make one last contribution, is to push some of those initiatives forward and get people involved with them. That'll be great.
Definitely. Dr. Meldrum, if people want to find you like online or find your books, tell everybody where they can look you up or maybe contact you or find that information.
Right. Well, I'm usually quite responsive to email. My email is meld@isu.edu. You can find me if you don't remember that. Just Google Idaho State University, and you can find me quite easily. The other way to kind of follow developments and things of interest and appearances and so forth on my webpage, which is under my full name, Don Jeffrey Meldrum. And as far as books and publications, most are available on Amazon, but I'd also direct you to a publisher of my field guides, Paradise K. That's K with a C-A-Y, Paradise K, which is out of Northern California. And they have expanded a tremendous line, a very fun and engaging line of Bigfoot items. Everything from very good books to entertaining books to fridge magnets and bottle openers and all kinds of metal art and so forth. It's really quite fun. And if you just look up them at parak.com, my book and field guides, as I said, and field notebook, a more recent edition, are all listed there as well.
Wonderful. And I just had somebody in the chat say that they'll go ahead and add those links and everything. And I'll go back after the end of the show and make sure and update the description box so that anybody watching or listening this can go find all those links and order the books and check it out. I've been a big fan of yours for the longest time and read your books. And every time I go up camping, I think some of your work, Dr. Meldrum, has affected every camping experience I've ever been on since I was pretty little. So you have affected me. I'm here doing this show, talking to you because of that loop of the small world that we live in, of how you've made an impression on me, the research that you've done, and the courage that you've had to step forward with your career on the line and jump in the deep end, making it safer for other people to do the same, to explain. So I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming on the show and answering all these questions and tough ones. And I hope to have you back. And if anything cool goes on in the field research, I would love to have you back and pick your brain about it a little bit.
That'd be great. Would love that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meldrum. And everybody for joining us. Thanks for joining us in the chat. And we will see you guys in the next one.
Okay. Take care.